In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate a finessed method of binding off in the middle of a row. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. This is a swatch with 30 stitches. I have 10 stitches right here, 10 stitches right here, and in the center I bound off 10 stitches. Now, the problem that you can sometimes get when you bind off, when you work some of the stitches, bind off in the middle and then continue working, is that the corners here can look a little strange. What you'll see at this corner is that there's kind of a gap because the bind off chain is typically centered between the middle of one stitch and the middle of the next stitch. So we get a gap here between the last stitch worked and then the first bind off chain. And then at this edge, what we have is the last bind off chain is kind of strangling the first stitch that was continued working on. If you're working something like a neckline where you're going to be picking up stitches around that edge and then knitting, say, ribbing, this weirdness that you get at the corners is not going to matter because you're going to be picking up stitches, one stitch in from the edge here and underneath the chain, and again one stitch in here. So you're not going to see this weirdness. But sometimes for sweaters, but then also for other sorts of projects, you might need to bind off in the middle of a row where that edge and those corners are going to remain exposed. And then you might want some techniques for kind of finessing those transitions from those that are continuing to be worked and then those that were bound off. So here's an example of a swatch where there was some finessing going on at these corners that helped to smooth things out a little bit and prevent that gap and prevent that strangulation. So here is a swatch that has the 30 stitches just like the other two. Now if I were going to bind off all of these stitches, you would understand that in order for me to bind off stitch number 1, I actually have to work stitches 1 and 2. So, and that's true all the way across. If I want to bind off stitch number 10, I have to work stitch number 11 first. That's true all the way across. So when I have worked stitch number 30, I can bind off stitch number 29, but stitch number 30 doesn't actually ever get bound off. Instead, we cut the yarn tail, we enlarge this stitch number 30 until the tail pulls out of it, and then we have 29 bind off chains above the 30 columns of stitches. That's just how binding off works. It's both the same and slightly different if we're going to bind off in the center of a row. So let's mark off. Let's say we're going to work 10 stitches and then bind off the center 10 and then work the last 10 to the end. So I'm going to mark off 10 stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8. So this is the 10th stitch here. This is the last stitch that's going to be continue to be worked. I'm going to mark that stitch. Then we have 10 stitches we're going to bind off. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So this is the last one that'll be bound off, but this is the first one that's going to remain being worked. So I'm going to mark that one. So what I've done is I've marked outside the stitches that are going to be bound off. So everything in between these two markers is going to be bound off. So again, I work the first 10 stitches. These are stitches that I want to remain on the needle. And now is when I'm going to start binding off. Now this is where it can get a little bit tricky for people and they can make a mistake. They know that they need to bind these off and so they work stitch number 11 and then they think they're going to start binding stitches off right away. But if I pulled this stitch off, that would mean that I was binding off stitch number 10, which I don't want to do. So we can pretend that these first 10 stitches aren't even there. In order for me to bind off stitch 11, I actually have to work 11 and 12. And now I can bind off stitch 11 and continue binding off as I go across. So now I have worked the last stitch of the bind off stitches, but I haven't actually bound off that last stitch. Remember, I always have to work a stitch ahead of what I'm binding off. So in order for me to bind off stitch number 20, I have to work stitch number 21. So I work stitch number 21, then I bind it off, and that's how that stitch ends up being strangled. So this is how you would work things if you were doing that standard method of binding off in the middle. Now, if you have directions that say knit 10, bind off 10, and then knit to the end of the row, you would do that and you'd end up with 10 stitches on each edge with 10 in the middle. But sometimes the directions will say knit 10, bind off 10, knit 10, and that's where people get confused again, because they finished binding off and now they only have 9 stitches left. And that's because the first stitch of that last knit 10 has to be worked before the last bind off stitch of the bind off 10 can be bound off. So you just need to check your stitch counts when you have an instruction that specifies the number of stitches that you're working after a bind off that occurs in the middle of a row. A traditional method would be knit 10, bind off 10, knit 10, and you would have to know that this is stitch number 1 of those 10. Some designers might say knit 10, bind off 10, and then knit 9. And if you add all of those stitches up, that's only 29 because they don't mention this one. So you might just need to confirm with your instructions and your stitch counts what the designer was likely to mean. Some designers are going to be much more clear. They'll say knit 10, now bind off the next 10, and they'll explain exactly how to do that. And when you've done that, they'll say bind off, that you'll have a stitch on the right hand needle, and they'll be much more explicit, but some designers are not explicit. So now let's do the bind off with those finessed corners. So again, I have the markers in the same locations on the last stitch that's going to continue being worked, and the first stitch over here that's going to continue being worked, and the others in the center are the ones that are going to be bound off. What we're going to do is an increase. We're going to do a knit front back increase when we work this very last stitch. So when we work stitch number 10, we're going to knit into the front. That creates stitch number 10, and then we're going to knit through the back of it to create an increase. This becomes stitch number 11 out of 31 stitches. We now have 31 stitches, not 30s. This becomes stitch 11. So now when we work this first stitch here of the original center stitches, that's stitch number 12. And remember, we had to work stitches 11 and 12 before we could bind off 11. So now the increase stitch that we got from knitting through the back is passed over here. So what we've done is we filled in that gap with an increase that we've then passed over, and that's what eliminates that gap that we would have otherwise gotten. So now we're going to continue binding off across the stitches, and I find it helpful to place the markers because I tend to lose count when I'm binding off. So if I know where I'm supposed to stop, then I don't have to count stitches. Okay, so now we're at that position where we would normally get the strangled stitch because we would need to work this stitch in order to bind that one off. What we're going to do instead is we're going to return this stitch back to the left hand needle, and we're going to knit them together like that. And what that does is it puts that bind off chain, the stitch that would have created the little noose around the neck, it just attaches it. It's just worked together so that it sits at the back of the work instead of the front. and then we maintain that column of stitches with no strangulation. So again, what we've done here is we did an increase in this last stitch here, and we incorporated that into the bind off, so that filled in that little corner gap here. And then what we did over here was, instead of strangling this stitch, we just worked the last stitch that we did have on the needle together with stitch 21, with using a knit two together, so that stitch 21 ends up on top of that bind off chain. You can kind of see it's behind there. There are many types of projects where stitches must be bound off in the center of a row, with the edges remaining exposed. The ribbed top edge of inset pockets is one place where you might want to avoid that bind off gap and strangled stitch, but there are other projects where the finesse technique comes in handy as well. If you found this video useful and would like to show your appreciation, you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.